There we go. So now we're. Oh, not yet. Okay, we're live. Okay, I think we're live.
Are we? We
I
did
will
it?
check. I will check.
Okay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Gravity Max live stream. Today is a very special episode, and I don't know how many people are watching. Okay, I think we are all good. Um, Actually, here, wait. I'm going to make sure the audio is good as well. Uh, just found a random pair of headphones on this desk. So probably one of my families. Anyway, welcome to this episode of the Gravity Max live stream. This is a very interesting episode of the Gravity Max live stream because Sebastian could not be in attendance. That is why his half of the slide is blacked out here because he does not have any power at his house because Connecticut was hit particularly hard by Hurricane Isaias on like Wednesday. And so we were gonna, plan an episode and we had a topic ready, but then yeah, I realized, oh, he doesn't have any power, and so we sort of figured things out. And I was thinking, okay, who should I get? Because I was thinking, wait, no one in Connecticut has power. So then my friend Jennifer, I was talking to her. She is here in Florida as well, and so we both have power, which is nice. So this is your first time on the show, so I'd like to thank you for coming. And helping out because otherwise this would have just been me rambling for like an hour about electrical grids. So let's get started with the plugs. Okay. This video is not intended for children under 13 years old. If you are under 13 years old, please do not watch this video as the topics we discuss are meant for those with at least a high school level of education. If you are not 13, you will not understand the scientific topics discussed in this video. Yeah, I could make that into like a rap. I get quicker every single time. It's just a disclaimer for COPA laws, basically, that people under 13 data stuff. Yeah, so don't watch this. Although I did get a comment like a week and a half ago from somebody named Robloxer on one of my videos, and they said, I am 12 and I watched. So I just find that funny because I'm like, well, I cannot control what people do. If they ignore the disclaimers, that is unfortunate. But please, if you are under 13, do not watch this video. You are not the intended target demographic. That's what really matters in the COPA law, the target demographic. Okay, so then visit the Gravity Max website at gravitymaxmedia.com and check out the Gravity Max social media pages for updates on that kind of thing, on Gravity Max stuff. Links in the description below. And then also, visit Sebastian's social media, although he's not here to rep it, I guess. He's got Instagram, Twitter, and also mainly check out his YouTube channel, 128 seconds on YouTube. He posts short educational videos that are 128 seconds long each. And I don't actually know, he said that he wasn't able to upload his video this week. He makes weekly videos usually. So we'll figure that out. But yeah, so let's see. Oh yes, and then also my book, A Bottled Up Flame, the sequel to A Truly Dead Rock, coming to Amazon on November 1st. Make sure to buy it if you would like to read the sequel to the thrilling sci-fi novel, A Truly Dead Rock. Yeah, I am very, let's see. I've been writing a lot recently because of the quarantine. Um, I'm happy that I have been given this opportunity to write, I guess, like trying to look at the bright side, that I have been able to get a lot of writing done recently. But yeah, check out this book because I put a lot of work into it and am continuing to do so because I'm still editing it. So yeah, that's that. Now we have our first title slide, power outages. So that's the topic today. We're going to talk about the electric grid and how the electric grid can mess up. So, yeah, because I thought it was an appropriate topic, just because, everyone in Connecticut does not have power. And yeah, it's interesting, actually. I see only one concurrent viewer, maybe two concurrent viewers. I do not know. That might just be us with the windows open.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, so I don't know. But people usually watch it back afterwards as well. A lot of people. So to everybody in Connecticut, um, I don't know, you can't really hear this, but watching back, I hope you get power soon. There's been a lot of frustration in Connecticut because of the electric grid company in Connecticut, like not fixing it in the time that people would have liked because this occurred on Wednesday, but it was also a pretty bad storm. But yeah, so we'll get into that all today. Yeah, let's see. I'm trying to think of what else to say. Oh, yes. So the electric grid, just as a brief overview, is, or actually, wait, that would be for the next slide. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. Oh, yes, Hurricane Isaias. I guess that's kind of what we were talking about. Yeah, people in Connecticut do not have power, and I think probably all across the Northeast they don't have power, but, I know people in Connecticut, a lot of people in Connecticut. I do not know anybody in like New Hampshire to ask if they have power. So hopefully you guys have power. I don't know. Yeah, Hurricane Isaias had hurricane force winds in Connecticut, and there have been debates on whether this was worse than Hurricane Sandy for Connecticut particularly. Um, and so, that's sort of the intensity level here. Connecticut, I don't know if we're getting a lot of Florida viewers just because we're Floridians. Florida is, known for getting hit by hurricanes, I suppose. Well, like the entire Southeast, really,
Yeah.
This is the hurricane place. People don't think about Connecticut as very prone to hurricanes. But occasionally they get one. It manages to get up there. I mean, we could talk about meteorology in another episode. Hurricanes need heat, so they don't go that far north. Oh, sorry, did you say something? I think it cut out.
Category 1. Isaias was Category 1 when it hit?
Yeah, Isaias was Category 1, I believe. Whereas Hurricane Sandy, when it hit Connecticut, was just a tropical storm at that point. It really struck New Jersey mainly. But basically, the trend is that people near the water are saying that Sandy was worse, and people more inland are saying that Isaias is worse. Because basically, it's about the wind and the knocking down of trees versus the storm surge from the tides, like the water flooding. So yeah, so the flooding was worse from Sandy, but then the wind and wind damage was worse from Isaias is sort of the trend. But I digress. Uh, we're going to talk about the power grid now. Okay, electrical grids. So electrical grids are really interesting things in my opinion. I mean, such a feat of engineering. The first electric grid was, I forget, 1882, I believe, was when it was first switched on. It was with Edison. Edison was, Thomas Edison. He was working on that, big rivalry, Edison and Tesla. But yeah.
Yep. Edison and his company and Westinghouse's company. Mm-hmm. Actually, it is funny that we always think of it as Edison and Tesla, even though the company was Westinghouse, which that's named after a guy. I forget his full name at the moment. But they purchased some patents that Tesla had, and that's how Tesla got involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Fun fact for you there.
Nice. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, definitely. I kind of I don't know why, I like the idea of historical rivalry between Edison and Tesla. They're just interesting figures. But anyway, they started this electric grid all the way back then. And now most of the developed worlds, anywhere you could go in America, there's like an electric grid, sort of. I mean, you can get really out into the wilderness and find spots without electric grids. But for the average person, and I mean the average person watching this live stream in particular, electric grids
obviously
are going
they have
to
electricity.
Exactly. All
Yeah.
encompassing. Shout out to anybody watching this with like a generator in the middle of the woods charging their laptop and is somehow getting satellite Wi-Fi. If you are, then I admire the dedication. Um, but
Actually, with their own like renewable energy, that's pretty cool too.
yeah, definitely. If you got a ton of solar panels hooked up, um, but yeah. So electrical grids are these complex like systems that bring power from a power plant to homes, businesses, hospitals, schools, you name it. And there's not a power plant in every single town. Power plants tend to be sort of concentrated and they aren't always near the population they serve. Although they do have to be somewhat close because of electrical resistance and the fact that the longer you go, you slowly lose power due to inefficiencies. But generally, the power plants are fairly far removed. And basically, any system that we have for generating power, uh, which we'll talk about power plants in a bit, but it's like the power plants sell the power and then we buy the power. The electricity, and the prices fluctuate throughout the day, and then it all sort of gets averaged out to your electric bill at the end of the month. You don't really look at power prices throughout the day. I think there are graphs for averages, but the problem is that basically electricity cannot really be stored in a wide sense. So you may think of like, oh, batteries. What about batteries? Laptops, phones. There are many devices that run on rechargeable batteries. Why can't we use that? And the reason is that those batteries are expensive. And if you were to try to, fill up a battery with the amount of power to just power your house for a day, that would have to be a very large battery. Um, and that's actually something that Elon Musk is working on, or his company, I think Tesla, they are working on battery technology because, to get longer range in the cars, the Tesla cars, they only get, well, not only, they get like 300 miles, which is about as much as a car with a fuel tank. So they've gotten pretty good at that. But they're always trying to make better batteries, lightweight batteries. And that's the same problem with the electric grid. There is no widespread system to just store power when you need more power.
That's
Um,
actually generally a pretty big problem with renewable energy too, because
mhm,
it's great when you have it, but then you can't really store it for all that long. People are working on it, kind of making a relation back to hurricanes and Tesla, though, now that
mhm,
you've brought the two up. I come from Louisiana, which is obviously known for Katrina and a bunch of other hurricanes. And the interesting thing about Tesla is they have their Model S and their Model T. Obviously, the more expensive one is designed to go further. And you would think that it's because it has better battery capacity or something like that. But it ended up being there was one storm that hit Louisiana. So to try and get people to help them get out before the storm hit or even after the storm hit and stuff, they made a temporary software fix to the cheaper model so that it would have the same fuel efficiency as the more expensive model, which goes to show you capitalism at work.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I wonder what. So they could have the same range. It's just they were
they
probably,
totally could. Yep.
huh?
It's just to make it like so that they have like a cheaper version and a more
Ah,
expensive
I see.
version.
Hmm,
They made it less quality.
huh.
Just a
I,
software glitch on
wow.
purpose, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if there was any sort of like trade-off that they were trying to make or something, or if it was just purely like marketing.
I
But yeah,
don't know
that's
on that. But
that's
yeah, the
interesting.
patch expired. I forget, but they made it that the patch only lasted for a certain amount of time.
Hmm.
So you couldn't be like, oh, woohoo, my fancy car.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh. That's interesting. Yeah, I wonder if you can hack a Tesla. Um,
Yeah,
but yeah,
that'd be
so
interesting.
yeah, the main problem with the electric grid is that there's just not like, there is no warehouse full of batteries that is ready to be recharged to like use in the event of like a surge in demand. And that's another thing because since power is used as it is created. There like is no storage capacity. The second that in like some joules of energy are created at some power plant, they go into use at, the house or whatever. So what ends up happening is that, say that a million people turn on a light switch at the same time, you've got a power surge, like a demand surge. So you need to produce more power to respond to that fluctuation and get it to people. And generally it fluctuates throughout the day fairly predictably, and then they have events, like they sort of graph it. It's sort of like you can think of like AI learning, although they might not use AI for this, but the more data you have on how much power people use, the better you get at just predicting it. So they have sort of days, and I bet they have like weeks, months, the average year. I bet they say like, oh, okay, on Thanksgiving Day, there tends to be this much power used. Like they
I mean,
probably.
as luck would have it, they do also have like backup, same way that your house would have a backup generator,
Mhm.
like in case the power goes out, like in case the grid doesn't have it. The grid also has different types of power that it can use, so that if there is a sudden blackout, for example, or if people suddenly all decide to turn on their devices for some reason, then they do have their own backup.
Mhm.
Usually, the more expensive types of power are what they'll use to supply the surplus, because of course if you were to use the more expensive kind for base level, that's a lot of
Yeah,
money wasted.
yeah,
So
exactly.
that's pretty cool too.
They optimize
um
it like that. Yeah. Um,
but yeah, you can have like hot days where everybody wants AC all of a sudden.
Definitely. Yeah, so that's another factor they'll look at, like the temperature, the weather, uh, and across the country too, because we'll get to that in a second. But like the power grids are very large and interconnected, um, because it's not just one power plant supplying your power. It's not one power plant connects to this region, this county, these counties. It's sort of a whole interconnected web, because that makes it better at dealing with these surges, because they will tend to get canceled out. Because if everyone in Connecticut does X at the same time and the power grid only supplies power to Connecticut, then it is more likely to get overwhelmed than if it's powering the whole country and it's able to sort of even things out. But yeah, definitely that's a big thing about like renewable energies. They sort of are very varying. They fluctuate a lot. Whereas
Great pun
different,
there.
yeah, thank you. Whereas different sources are more reliable, but then they also take a longer time to turn on if there is a problem. So what they do for these like power plants that can take a week or something to get up and running is that they only deal with them for fluctuations such as people use more like cooling in the summer, AC in the summer.
When it's
They'll sort of,
predictable.
yeah, something predictable. They can rev up their power plants, their extra power plants. But for the shorter ones, they do need to deal with these, like, sometimes renewables can help, but it's like interesting how they deal with it. Um, but yeah, that's sort of the power grid. We're going to get into now how it gets from the power plant to your home. So we start with the divisions of the U.S. This mouse just decided. Oh, it's dead. Okay. Uh, my brother had an electric or a wireless mouse that he uses for gaming, I guess, on his computer, and so I had. But anyways, now I'm using the trackpad. So, um, so the divisions of the U.S. So if there are any European viewers, this I guess does not apply to you, unfortunately. If you're
Later,
watching,
I have something on the EU grid later.
yeah, all right, great, yeah. So don't worry. If you're watching at 10 or 11 p.m. in Europe, then just hold on a little longer because we have some information later. But yeah, so the U.S. specifically is split into the eastern half, the western half, and then Texas. Because, I don't know, don't mess with Texas.
Quebec. Those are the other two
Oh,
grids.
yes,
This
and
one,
Quebec.
yeah. So for Canadian viewers, you can see that this diagram also includes the divisions of the Canadian territories, which unfortunately I don't remember all the names of the territories, but I know that Quebec and Texas each have their own grid for some reason. Um, And then Alaska has its own grid, but of course you could be like, well, it's really far away, so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then presumably Hawaii has its own grid.
Probably.
Yeah.
That's actually a
So,
good point.
yeah, exactly. But anyway, these grids, they're divided up. And it actually looks like it goes into Mexico a little bit on the west coast. Um, but yeah, so these are the grids that provide power. So they're all connected. If you are, using a toaster in New Brunswick, right? You are using the same power grid as someone who is also using a toaster in Kansas, which that's a very long distance away. Or if you are in Manitoba, you're connected as well to Florida. So, yeah, those are the Canadian provinces, some of them. Yeah, so, it's very large system, as I was saying just like a minute before, about how it helps them deal with power surges, because generally it is difficult for something to make the entire East Coast or West Coast of the United States do something. Um, like I couldn't think off the top of my head of what would require, like what would cause a power surge like that. It's just tiny fluctuations that like proportionally. So it helps them manage things better to have such large.
Two grids before we switch off. Of course, there are going to be more specific grids. Like, I know the East for sure has some subdivisions involving Florida, and then like different parts of like the Ohio River Valley as well. Like, obviously, it's going to break down further than this, the same way that countries break into states and provinces and stuff like that. But yeah, these are the main three, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. The subdivisions, I think it's sort of like they usually stay within their own sort of system, but then they have a few wires to connect to the next system, like in case the next system reports like we have a big demand surge here, and like, oh, we have a surplus, and then sent knocked over.
Yep.
Uh, okay, okay, all good, all good. But what was I saying before I knocked the water bottle off the table? But yeah, so that, is how the grid deals with surges. I think it's interesting to have such a large grid that spans multiple countries as well. Um, Even though Texas, is on its own, but like the eastern one goes up to Canada and as well, and the western one goes into Mexico. It goes into Baja California a little bit. Um,
State taking a notch out of Louisiana, it seems. And also, if you zoom in,
yes.
like the very top of the Texas, like the little bar thing at the top, that's part of the Eastern grid, interestingly. So,
Yeah.
that's, as you
Yeah,
may
like
notice, this Texas one is not entirely Texas shaped.
it's an incomplete Texas grid. It looks like Texas has been chipped away. I think, for instance, El Paso would be on the western interconnection. But the other cities, the main like Austin, Dallas, Houston, Fort Worth, San Antonio, like those central Texan cities are all on the Texas grid. Um, but yeah, I see they nicked a little bit of Louisiana. Um, but yeah, I think that's it on these interconnections divisions of the U.S. All right, so I'm going to go to the next slide. Power plants. So now we're going to power plant to the home. So we start with power plants, and I think these are nuclear power plants.
Yep.
Yeah, the nuclear columns. I kind of like the aesthetic of those. Yeah, so Connecticut. Huh?
When they're done, what they're done with them, they destroy them. The way that they fall is pretty interesting too.
That's interesting. Yeah. Imagine just being done with a nuclear plant. What can cause that? Just
The
being
uranium disagrees.
Oh, okay. I see.
The uranium is not
becomes
done with you.
the area becomes too. Who knows? Yeah. Anyway, let's see. Connecticut is very nuclear power based, actually. Connecticut specifically produces a lot of nuclear power. I think it was somewhere around 40% of Connecticut's power is nuclear power, and Connecticut is a net exporter of power as a state, which you don't think about that much because, it's just the country. But if you look at Europe, you actually can see that different European nations are net exporters or importers
Hmm.
of power as well.
Even within other states in the U.S. as well, like you have Louisiana and Texas, of course, are right next to the Gulf. I mean, so are the other Gulf states, but they're particularly known for their natural gas as
Hmm.
well. There's even a dead zone in the Mississippi Delta right outside like Louisiana, New Orleans area. That it's just there's that much like pollution that kind of washes down all of the Mississippi River that ends up there that it's a bit of a dead zone. Um, Interestingly, though, Texas, you would think it's in the South. You'd think it's like the oil and like the West too.
Hmm.
It's actually got a lot of wind power going there. So you've got a lot of wind turbines in Texas as well.
Interesting. Yeah. Um, but yeah, so we've been talking about a ton of different power sources, and so the way that power plants, if you think like wind, nuclear, like, coal, oil,
Geothermal
yeah, how do
as
all of
well.
these things produce electricity? So that goes into just sort of how electricity is made. And the general way that it happens in pretty much everything except photovoltaic cells is that some process spins a turbine, and that turbine is, magnetic. It's like magnetically charged. And oh, lightning just right out my window over there. Really big flash. It looked close. Um, but let's see. What was I saying? Uh,
That's actually, yeah, that's a big thing. Because I know that they're trying to do like wave energy and trying to use
mhm,
the ocean that way too. And still, they can't find. I mean, of course, they're working on it, but they're trying to
yeah.
find ways to get turbines to work with the waves in the ocean. You can do other things like solar panels. You were saying the photovoltaic cells, but turbines are just the way to go. It's like one of the first ones we came up with, and one of the best ones so far, which is pretty funny to think about. It's always about making steam out of whatever you've got
Yep.
so that the steam can push the turbine.
Exactly. Yeah. So whether it's nuclear or coal or fossil fuels, uh, they the burning or nuclear reactions heat up water enough that it becomes steam, and then it rises and it spins a little turbine. And electromagnetism means that electricity and magnetism are connected. So when the turbine, which is magnetically, it's made of magnets essentially, when it spins, uh, it transfers, its motion. The motion of magnetic field results in the creation of an electric field in wires that are sort of wrapped around this turbine, and then that goes out from the power plant to enter the electric grid. Uh,
Obviously, with wind power, it's the same thing. It's
mhm,
just instead of your fluid being water, the fluid is the air itself.
yep.
And I think you have like hydroelectric dams too, which we didn't mention, which
Ah,
is
yes.
literally just a matter of like, oh, the water goes over it and then it
Mhm,
pushes the thing.
yeah.
Um, so those are turbines. They're great.
Yeah, exactly. Um, so let's see. Do turbines necessarily produce AC power, alternating current? I did not.
Actually, no.
No.
I don't know. It
Oh,
could
okay.
be, but I don't.
Yeah.
I'm trying to because actually I'm thinking now that I think about it we could talk about this with like outages. You have
Mhm,
with like for example I'm on a robotics team, and in those that if you try to push too much power into the robot,
mhm,
it will suddenly it'll have a brownout where it just kind of drops and it doesn't have any energy left. But the motors, which motors are kind of, as you were saying with the turbines, they spin. If you suddenly cut the power to the motors, they will try to keep the circuit going. And so they'll try to push more energy into the system, and then they'll temporarily become generators. That's not good for the motors. It's not what they're supposed to do.
oh, okay.
But it's just the idea that like the motors and the generators are kind of interconnected with the same spinning motion powering the circuit. Um,
That's cool. Um,
yeah.
but yeah, because I'm pretty sure I was just gonna say about the AC versus DC, not the band, but that's sort of what they're named after. Um,
Yep.
so the direct current, I imagine that photovoltaics would produce direct current because um, when sunlight hits them, it results in a single direction stream of particles of electrons. So I imagine that might be a reason why solar panels are expensive. Because I think you said to me actually as we were doing research that it is a lot easier to change AC into DC than DC into AC. Um, yeah. So
easy to control AC power in terms of like, we're going to get into this later, like with all the making it in giant quantities for the power plants and then siphoning it down to the houses. It's definitely a lot easier to use AC to ramp up and ramp down the amount of power you have, because DC, like you're going to see on the next slide, DC, it's only one line. It doesn't have the waves, so it's harder to like
yeah,
amplify or decrease or whatever.
yeah. But yeah, so basically the alternating current, how it looks, I guess, is that the electrons are moving back and forth in like a sine wave. And so the voltage, or is it the amperage? I forget. Is the voltage? I think it's the voltage goes up and down in a sine wave because sometimes the flow of electrons is backwards and then forward.
The amperage is measuring current, so it's the amount, or I guess it's kind of like if you've ever done the hose analogy, the voltage is like the difference in potential, so it would be like the slope of your
Oh,
hose, and then current is kind of like the amount of stuff or the speed at which I've heard other people say like that's not a good analogy, but at its most
yeah.
basic, current is more of like the amount of electrons going through at a time.
Okay.
So that's a way to think of it.
Yeah, I have been confused by that before, and I will be confused by it again. Uh, but yeah, so the electrons move back and forth, and that's alternating current. That's why it's, alternating, because it's going back and forth. But direct current does not alternate. It's just a constant stream. And yeah, so
It's
there
as
are,
you would typically think of it for sure. Just
yeah,
kind of going through and that's it.
yeah, exactly. So there are problems with it. Direct current is actually used, batteries, if you just pull out a AA battery to stick in a remote, uh, that is direct current. And there are a lot of things that run on direct current. I think you said that it was like our electronic devices run on.
Yeah, with direct current, because it's more stable, it's just this is what you're getting, this is
Mhm.
it. Pretty much every household electronic you have is actually using direct current. And the wall itself it's getting alternating current from the grid. And so you have to have some sort of adapter that converts it. That's let me think. Actually, so with alternating current, it's for anybody doing calculus. The reason why it is it's kind of like direct current in that they have like an average value, integral over interval,
Yep.
um, and it just kind of it tries to stay around. In the U.S., it's 60 hertz, and Europe, it's 50 hertz. See, I got my Europe shout out. Um, so yeah, and then direct current, it's probably just a fixed something. It's a
Mhm.
lot easier to do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, like probably like circuits you work with are generally going to be DC because those are safer and just more straightforward to think about.
It's interesting. I think some analog clocks actually run by counting how many times the
Yep.
electricity varies.
Actually, like again, I have a story on this if we want to jump into this, I guess a little early.
Hmm.
So in like I said, in Europe they have 50 hertz, and like you were saying, they also have the clocks like that like your microwave, your oven, anything you plug into the wall, like your alarm clock, those they all count the hertz of the electricity to count time. Obviously, if it's 50 hertz in Europe, it's going to be 50 times, and then they're like, oh, that's a second. So
Hmm.
they use that to keep time. It's great. But in 2018, from January to March, the whole EU grid, of course, it's all interconnected. So when one country had a bit of a shortage in the amount of power it was able to supply, the average went down from 50 hertz to 40.9 or 49.996 hertz.
Uh-oh.
So it only went down a little bit, but that was enough for over those 3 months for the EU clocks to slow down by 6 minutes. Um, and so what they had to do is by April, they finally resolved it
Hmm.
by increasing the amount of power to like something slightly above 50 hertz. And then they just did that for a few weeks so that the clocks could catch up. It's pretty interesting for the
Yeah.
EU separatists out there. The British grid is separate from the EU grid. Well, they obviously have some connection, but it's largely separate. So the British people didn't have any problems with their clocks, while the rest of Europe did. So
Yeah. That's
That was
really
an interesting thing
interesting.
to find.
Yeah, definitely. Because what I was about to suggest was if you take an American clock to the EU or a European clock to America, you could have it run slower or faster by a significant amount. Um,
Adapters, of course, because you want to make sure that
hmm,
they receive the energy properly.
yeah.
Um,
Oh, so that's what the
let's
wall
see.
adapters do in,
Yep.
huh, they change it. Yeah, that's interesting. I was about to bring up this. So this is, this is the block for an iPhone. And I think you said that this converts, in this little block, it converts alternating current to direct current for the charging.
Sure, but I'm because it might actually be that the house is DC. I'm not sure on
Oh,
that,
okay.
but I do know that like obviously the grid when it comes into your house, it has to make it so that it's but that I know that besides the port difference, yeah, there is something to do with direct current coming to your devices. They won't accept alternating current because that's too volatile.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it was Tesla and Westinghouse were big proponents of direct current and just making the whole grid direct current, whereas Edison was like, no, we got to use alternating current. So that's part of the debate.
Winning out for alternating current because like I was saying earlier, which we have a slide on it later, it's easier for it to be scaled up and scaled down. So if actually, would you mind going to the next slide? We have the
Sure.
transmission stage, um, where from the power plant you have it scale up these thingies, these I forget what they're called, but like the transmission stations, they increase the amount of power. They just kind of ramp it up, and then it travels over the wires because you need it to actually be higher. The higher it is, the less it loses. I'm not actually sure why, but the higher the current you run through, the less energy it'll lose along the way. And so then when it gets to the local area, it will another one of these transmission stations will ramp it down again, and then you can bring it into your house
Yeah.
with another trans what's it called, another transmitter thing on the, that's not the transformer, that's the word I'm looking
Yes.
for,
Yeah.
sorry, another transformer on the line. Like if you've ever looked at the power lines like outside your window, I'm pointing to my window that way, you'll see like those little boxes, those are smaller transformers.
Hmm.
So that's pretty nice that they do that for us.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
oh yeah,
So,
and then with, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to talk about the three phase thing, but
Yeah, go ahead.
okay, sure. Yeah. Uh, so the alternating current from the power plants comes in three phases, and each is an individual sine wave of the alternating current. Um, the reason that they do three phases is that three phases makes it such that there will never be a point in time where all three phases are at zero, where they all cross it at the same time. Whereas if you had one phase, it would be like that, obviously, because it's the only one. And if you had two phases, it wouldn't necessarily be like that, but if the two phases are spaced evenly, it will end up like that. But if they're sort of spaced like right next to each other, it wouldn't. Um, but the three phases is nice and symmetrical, and it makes sure that you never have a point where they're all at zero. Only one is at zero at any given time. So that is why there are three wires, as you see on the right, because each wire is carrying a different phase of the alternating current. And it's crazy because since these are 60 or 50 hertz, they're only like a fraction of a second apart. Um, and yeah, that's why if you actually look at most power lines,
I
you'll
think when
see.
being transmitted, it's higher.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Sorry. Um, hold on. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, but if you look at power lines on your street, you'll see that they come in threes, and any additional wires are different utilities like cable or phone. But if you look just here at this picture, you can see the origin of these three wires and then how they entered these really large power lines, not like street level power lines, but you might see these sometimes just sort of out in the middle of nowhere. And then sometimes out in the middle of somewhere. But that just they're huge metal things and they like go along and they're pretty cool. I kind of like them. They're interesting. I feel like they would be like towers that like ancient or not ancient, but future civilizations, like if there was like an apocalypse, they would like look at these towers and be like, what were these things they that go all around? Um, if any are still standing, that would be. But yeah.
But yeah, on the next slide, you can
Hmm.
see my little diagram I made that
Yes.
talks about what I was talking about earlier
Oh wait.
with the step up and step down transformers.
Hmm.
Actually, I'm going to have you go back to the other slide another
Oh,
second.
sure thing.
So the one with the transmission substations. Um,
Transmission substations. Okay, here we go.
yes. So if you can see on the right side of this image, it's got that like big three spike thingies.
Hmm.
So that is what it will either ramp it up or ramp it down. It'll again ramp it up to travel and ramp it down once it gets to like the town or whatever that you want it to be in. And then on the next slide, we have how the transformer works.
Yep.
And so let's see. So on that, you're going to have on the right, I have, so in this case, it is stepping down.
Okay.
Because on the pink, you have a bunch of turns, and that means it's going to have a really high voltage and a lower amperage. Notice the power is constant. And then when you get to the other side, it's got fewer turns and a lower voltage, but a higher amperage. So that means there's less potential difference, but it's got more electrons per second in that area. But we really only care about voltage at this point. So it's got a lower
Okay.
voltage, so it's stepped down. So that's, in theory, less dangerous. I mean, electricity is kind of complicated, so it's
Yeah.
still dangerous pretty much no matter what you do. But
exactly.
it's more acceptable for the house, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. Like if you were to probably touch one of those random power lines out in the middle of nowhere, that would be way more severe than like a house. Like
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, it's still bad if you hit a house.
In
But
general, yes.
yeah, like you may wonder, you're like, what about the birds? The birds are sitting on those power lines and they're fine. The big thing is they're not touching the ground, so that's not creating a voltage difference. Because if one foot's on the power line and the other foot's on the same power line, there's no difference. Whereas a person is usually touching it from the ground. So you've got the ground and then the person, and that's quite the difference. So it'll travel through the person and electrocute them. Yes. That kind of brings us to more of a morbid segue to the electric chair. It was invented by a dentist, interestingly. So I know there's tropes about, oh, the dentist is scary. Now you have a reason.
Exactly.
Actually, no, I'm sure you have reasons otherwise. But yeah, a dentist was the guy that invented the electric chair because he noticed that back when these electrical grids were new, he noticed that workers would approach them and then accidentally just kind of die spontaneously from touching them because, of course, they're carrying a lot of power. So he was like, well, they die so quickly, so instantly, maybe that's a more humane way to kill somebody than hanging. So he came up with the electric chair, where it's the same concept as if you were to touch one of those lines. They run the power through yourself, and it's supposed to kill the person. The very first attempt was botched, and it's a little sad. I mean, this is often with any experiment that we do. We tested it on humans. Before we tested on humans, we tested on like horses and dogs. It's a big part of the war of currents, though, because you have AC versus DC again. And of course, DC's like, oh my gosh, AC is more dangerous. And AC's like, no, we're fine, we're great. And so, again, we mentioned Westinghouse and Edison. Edison really wanted to make sure that the electric chair was first powered by a Westinghouse generator. Of course, Westinghouse thinks that's terrible publicity, but one competitor of Westinghouse ended up partnering up with Edison. I forget the company. And they made sure that the first execution was with a Westinghouse generator.
Craziness.
But so yeah, I'm trying to think what else on that. Obviously, the electric chair didn't quite work. It's since been phased out with lethal injection instead. I'm not gonna say anything one way or the other. I know it's a bit of a political issue with capital punishment, but I'm also please don't be like, oh, it's like an electric chair. Don't go touching the wires outside. Common sense.
Yeah. That's, don't worry, we got that 13-year-old disclaimer. We shouldn't have anyone young and stupid. So I don't know. 13-year-olds can also be young and stupid. But let's see. What's the next? But yeah, well, this is really interesting because DC current cannot do this, right? It can't, like, it doesn't step down.
Down. Yeah, it doesn't.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there was one thing I was looking at earlier today in preparation for the show. If you take like a voltmeter and you run it through like a standard battery, like you were saying, it's DC, so the graph will just show a line. But if you touch the two things to themselves, it will show the power that runs through it is AC, and it will just show like the little curves. But yeah, because of this, it can step down. And then if you were to try and do stepping down with DC, it's either on or off. That's how it works. It's direct. It's one value, on or off.
Yeah.
Which makes it useful for computers too. And that's why it's in your household devices.
Yes. Yeah. Like binary. But yeah, so AC has won out in the current wars. But yeah, largely, or maybe not largely, but partly because of its ability to step down like this, to like become weaker, which is useful. But yeah, let's see. So now we go to the next slide. Okay, so we got power transportation. And so I put up a little diagram of the circulatory system, just as like a metaphor here. So this is sort of connected to the stepping down and stepping up transformers, mostly the stepping down part. So this is basically when power goes from the power plant, it travels across the countryside and then it gets to a town, for instance. And so what it does is that each town, I think, actually has its like own main power line, or like transformer station. It has its own place where it steps down the power. So it takes the power that it receives, it steps it down, and then it spreads it out to the rest of the town, which I find pretty interesting if you look at sort of like main arteries that give way to like lesser arteries, which give way to capillaries. Of course, there aren't two. Like, there's not veins as well because it's just one power system. It only needs to go in one direction. It doesn't need to come back to the power plant. But I just sort of like metaphors like that. I just find it interesting. Sort of like the fractal nature of things that always comes back.
In the same way that you've got surge protectors and like this surge protector outlet thingy, you've also got your heart. That's got valves too to prevent your blood from going backwards. Yep. So the analogy works quite well.
Nice.
Then yeah, same thing with electricity. You need it to be in a circuit to work. I think it's a good analogy.
Thank you. Yeah, I like it. I like analogy.
This is just a safety note I'm noticing with this surge protector, by the way.
Oh yeah, don't do this.
Yeah, try to put not as many. And if you do, okay, don't put extension cords in surge protectors or vice versa. I have learned that is, luckily not through experience, but I have learned like that is a safety violation.
Okay.
So if you wanted to do like, oh, I'm going to put this extension cord and then put my power surge at the end, I mean, nobody's technically going to stop you. But I'm just warning you, it's not a safe idea.
Wait. So which is the surge protector? Is it the entire, because I've always called this thing that has a ton of outlets on it, I've called it a bus bar, I've called it, also a power strip. Those are the two things.
Power strip, but it's also usually it has a surge protector ability.
Okay.
Like usually it does both. It both allows all these guys to have power and prevents surges, which when you're handling that much power, you kind of have to be good at preventing surges. But yeah, if you wanted to put an extension cord into this or this into an extension cord, don't.
Okay.
I mean, you could, but
that makes sense. Okay, and in extension cords, just like get this to the garage.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, so don't do that. Interesting. Yeah, I know. I've sort of been like, just sort of like, I like this picture where it's plugged into itself and it's infinite power. Of course, obviously no power.
Seen that kind of thing.
Yeah, but I just find it interesting, the idea. Now, don't do this of just sort of having one power strip and then plugging in another power strip at each
Just
notch and
making a fractal.
just exponentially growing the power strip and then plugging a ton of things in. Of course, that will likely cause like a electrical failure, probably.
Probably.
So don't do that. Anyway, so the power transportation, when the power, gets from the power plant, that could be many counties away. And it's sort of all, mixes together just because it's in the interconnect. So you're not getting power from just one source, but it comes to your town, and your town has a main little power distribution transformer that steps it down and then runs a ton of wires off of it to like get to the different parts of town. And then, maybe the different districts of town have their own transformers that get smaller for like neighborhoods and things to like run through. But sometimes your town will also have like a backup system where if your transformer is taken down, like I guess if you make a deal with your neighboring town, like, oh, if our main transformer gets taken down, can we sort of, plug an extension cord in? Not really, but they have extra lines that connect the towns. You're getting thunder here. But sometimes they'll have extra lines that connect two towns together in the case that one town goes out, so that the other town can they can both power each other. But sort of like systems like that, which I find interesting, because Connecticut was, 98% of people were without power, which is interesting because you got to think 98% of the power grid was not destroyed, right? Like, obviously, that would be madness. But with what was destroyed, somehow 98% were left without power. So we'll get into that a little bit later with power outages. But it's just interesting, that everything is connected somehow.
The chain is
That's
only as strong as its weakest link.
exactly, yeah.
Yep.
So let's see. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So we are getting smaller scale here. This is power distribution. So this is just sort of an average power line you might see on your street. Some neighborhoods actually have buried power lines. I believe that is what my neighborhood has because I don't see any power lines and I have power, so I must assume that they are somewhere else underground, probably. um, but
And
yeah,
then,
so
of course, you may wonder, like, why doesn't everybody have these? Of course, these are usually cheaper to just put them without, burying them. And then also depending on, like, what's underground. Like, I know Florida has a lot of sinkholes and stuff because it's made of pretty, well, obviously solid enough foundations, but, like limestone or softer
yep.
things. So it also depends on, like, what's underground. Same reason why we don't have basements here in the South. Like, it's mostly water underneath.
Interesting. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
and it's also kind of a pain to fix because you have to take it out and dig it and blah,
Definitely.
blah.
Yeah, so it's more expensive, but it can be more protected. Like, I think California uses a lot of underground power lines so that they don't fall over in an earthquake. And yeah, interestingly enough, so Connecticut uses very few underground power lines. They use a lot of just sort of traditional, upright above ground power lines. And I sort of like to think of it just because it's sort of older. I don't know, it's an older place. Whereas, because it's interesting. I like this. I heard someone say it before, but I can't forget who. It's that in Connecticut, the roads were built for horses and then adapted to cars. Whereas in Florida, the roads were built for cars, which is why the roads here, I would say, are better, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's actually why roads are pretty narrow in Europe, too, because they're made before cars.
Exactly.
But really, Connecticut has mostly above ground stuff. I would think like you would try to put it underground because, like I said, with like basements, it's the ground is fine. And also with snow, do you guys ever have just power outages because there's too much snow on a line or something?
I think there have been blizzards have caused power outages. But that could equally be because it could be wind and snow combined.
Yeah.
Usually, if it's just a gentle like snow, just a straight like no wind snow, it tends not to happen. But yeah, definitely. I don't know why they keep it above ground. It would be a very big project to put it underground. But something about Connecticut is that there are a lot of trees, very dense trees, just everywhere trees. And I have actually seen things that would probably make you be like, oh, with a power grid. That there are like trees that will be like sheared, basically like half of the tree is erased because it is like a foot away from a power line and it towers, many dozens of feet above the power line. And I'm like, okay, as soon as there is a storm, that power line is going down. But yeah, we'll get into that. We have a whole slide about trees, so we'll talk about that in a
Oh
second.
yes.
But yeah, so power distribution, uh, above ground, underground, however it be, it goes by your house and then it connects to your house. And so this is how it connects to your house. This next slide, home power. So up there we got a power line with a transformer on it to step down the power for its final stepping down and bring it into the home. And it's that little cylinder thing up there.
Circuit breaker on the right here.
Yep. Yeah. That's another thing.
This is actually something I've learned. So these are called circuit breakers. Of course, you may have heard of like fuses as well. I recently learned that the difference between a circuit breaker and a fuse is that a fuse, like in a Christmas tree light string, when it breaks, it's broken, and you've got to just buy a new one, replace it. But with the breaker, what it normally does is it pops out. So when the circuit breaks, it just, like if there's like a surge or some sort of like there's water or something, it'll just pop out, and then you have to manually put it back in.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so the reason you might need that, I guess, if the transformer fails at its job, every house I think sort of has either fuses or circuit breakers. Circuit breakers are newer. So if there's a power surge, what happens is that the power, the wire begins to overheat, kind of like an incandescent light bulb might. Except the problem is that it's not, a light bulb, it's your wire. And so if it heats up, it might melt the insulation and then it might eventually start a house fire. And that's the reason that light bulbs are kept in vacuums too, because the wire cannot interact with the gases in the air if it's in a vacuum, which is interesting. Or incandescent lights, at least. So
that reminds me of like computers back in the day when they used to fill entire rooms. They would used to do like cathodes and like those diodes. It would just be like a giant cathode and an anode in a vacuum, and it would be pretty tall too. I mean, not super tall, about as tall as a person, I think, something like that. And they're giant. And then luckily we came up with semiconductors. So instead of conducting electricity more like a light bulb, it's more of just a on-off type thing. And they're much smaller. Of course, they can get to like microchip size now. So
those are so cool.
Electricity, it's all related.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of interrelation here. Electricity, it runs our world. It's like it's the main, not the main, but I would say it's the main utility that sort of distinguishes modern society from like ancient civilizations. Like even Rome had like aqueducts, so they had plumbing to a certain degree, although it was full of lead. But they had it, right? They did not have electricity though, so electricity is very encompassing. I mean, especially with the virus, the COVID coronavirus. Everyone's on the internet more. Everyone's relying more on their electronic devices.
It is funny how like the electronics and the internet, they've totally become like such a big thing in life. Like it's really funny. Actually, just yesterday I had my internet cut out for some reason, and of course we were like, oh, let's just listen to try and do something away from the computer. So how about like, I don't know, you just pull out some music and jam. But wait, where's the music? It's on the computer, on the internet. And like there's just different things that you like. There's so many things that it's like, oh, I'll just Google it. Wait.
I cannot Google it. Yeah,
exactly.
No Google. Yeah. Yeah, it's difficult. The only thing you can really do at that point is read. But then sometimes I even have like I
Online.
read books on my computer a lot. Um, the majority of the time, unless I have to annotate it for school, I usually just read it on the computer. Uh,
Shout
so,
out to people who haven't done their summer homework yet.
oh yeah,
Ooh.
reading Brave New World. Are you liking it?
I have actually not started. I'm one of those
Oh,
people.
okay.
I
I'm not
mean,
that. I'm not. I'm only like a third of
I'm
the way through.
usually not that bad. I think COVID has kind of left
Hmm.
everybody a little disillusioned. Um,
Definitely. I have had very inconsistent sleep this past week. I have not had like I usually go like okay 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. or just something, anything standard. Uh, it has not been like that. It has not been standard recently.
what's the worst it's been lately?
I would say the worst it's been was a few nights ago. It took me until like maybe like a week ago. It took me until like 6 a.m. to fall asleep, and then I woke up at like
Gosh,
3, forgetting my place in the world. Just like, where
wow.
am I? I have entered the future. It was interesting. But yeah, so home power, yeah, so the transformers will bring the electricity into your house from the power line from the grid to its final, destination at your house. And the circuit breaker, as I was saying, if your wires heat up, the circuit breakers sort of sense, or not sense, but they pop out if it gets too hot. They pop out if it gets too hot, and then you'll have to basically flip the switch to bring it back in. But fuses, what they do is that when they get too hot, they evaporate essentially. They just melt much faster than the other things would, which
I
is
like how you just call it evaporating. I mean,
they
is
like
that actually what it's
vaporize.
called?
I don't know. They like blow when you blow a fuse. Um,
Yeah.
it like it burns up very quickly, um, and which is good because if you didn't have a fuse like that, then the wire would get incredibly hot. It would continue to heat up, but once the fuse breaks at the lower temperature, then everything's back to normal again. Because
If we're willing to talk about household electronic or electrician type things,
mm,
my grandfather was an electrician, so I know a little bit.
mm,
So wire gauging, I've noticed, is it's usually like the thinner the wire, the higher the number.
right.
So any starter electricians, that's something that's good to know. Why, I don't actually know. I should probably look into it. Maybe we'll talk about that more another time.
Yeah.
And then you also have what's called a hot wire, which is usually white. If you look at like, if you're to say like, if you look at your outlet and you try to unscrew it and take it out of the wall, like it would have white wires. Which, by the way, if you're going to do this again, find the breaker responsible for that circuit and turn it off, and then
Mm,
take it out.
yes.
So you've got the hot wire, which is white, and you've got the other wire, which is black. So black and red are always going to be transferring power around, completing the circuit. As we all know, with electricity, you need a complete circuit for it to actually work. And then white one is going to have the most power. It's going to be the signal. It's going to be what actually lets it turn on or off.
Hmm.
Um, like you've got like black and red that are just actually, you don't always need red in a house. Like you usually because you could just have black relay around. It's usually so like that's your base level, and then white is what actually makes it turn on. Like I was saying, where did I go with this? And what else did I forgot. So that's
It's
my
okay.
at the end
It's
of my
okay.
statement.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
fine.
that was
Live
it. I had
show.
another
Oh yeah.
thing. I'm looking at the circuit breaker here on this slide, and I can't help but think, for some reason my house, it was wired really, really strangely. Um, None of the circuits seem to make sense. You would think that, of course, it would be like, oh, this room is its own thing, this room is its own thing. Um, you can have like different walls connected, even if they're not adjacent within your house.
Yeah.
And sometimes, like, you have the GFCI outlets, which are usually like they're the ones that they handle if you get water. So they're usually outside or like in the sink or something, so that if you accidentally get it wet, it knows to shut off, whereas a
Mm,
normal outlet wouldn't. And so, like, we had one of those that if it's exposed, it'll get hit by a little bit of rainwater or something, and it'll throw itself off. And then a completely different room in the house, it's not even near that wall, will be out because that outlet threw itself into safety mode, essentially. So that's another quirky thing for people
Yeah, that's
interested in
really interesting.
electricity, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah,
Hopefully your electrician is a little smarter in how they built your house.
yeah, yeah. I like this circuit breaker because it reminds me of that scene from Jurassic Park. You know what I'm talking about? I've probably seen the movie.
Absolutely no.
It's the
But
one where Ellie Sattler is turning on, is like manually resetting the park's power. Um, I have watched that movie more times than the average person, I would say. I would say maybe 90th percentile, maybe 95th. You know what? 99th. I don't know. I don't know how
oh
often people
wow,
really
okay.
watch. I like. I bet a lot of people just have not watched the movie at all, which is very personally shocking. I would say I hardly believe that. But anyways, that is sort of how power gets to your home, and then we have a final step, which is sort of like backwards, I guess. This is home power generation. So increasingly, I would say I do not know the statistics, but I know that it is on the rise of the amount of people that install solar panels on their roofs to generate their own power sometimes. And, like, how does that work? So it's really interesting because they are still connected to the grid in most cases. I mean, you might have, they are specifically off the grid, but it's not like in the middle of a suburban neighborhood, they are randomly going to be just off the grid. So the solar panels sort of act as like mini power plants and form another component in the grid. So obviously the power varies a lot, just like from the power grid, the demand. So the demand from inside the house, and then, if there's a storm like there currently is for us, the power will go down. At nighttime, the power will go down, things like that. But what solar panels end up doing is reducing your electric bill because not only are you purchasing power from like the power marketplace, you are also capable of selling power to the power marketplace because sometimes your solar panels will be generating more power than your house is using. And I find that really interesting. I'm not sure how much of a cost saving measure it is exactly because solar panels themselves are expensive. I think it's mostly, I would say, a like environment saving measure when people do it. Or also, if their state government subsidizes it in some cases, it can actually be profit. Like I think um, California has a ton of like solar panel subsidies. Uh, so like if you get solar panels, if you get your house decked out with solar panels, they'll like give you credit back. And I don't know how it works. Something complicated with taxes. Mm. But I know that in certain states it'll be more profitable to get solar panels than others.
Obviously, Florida being the Sunshine State,
Yep.
probably for the two of us better than Connecticut. I don't know.
Mhm.
Does Connecticut get a lot of sun?
Uh, I don't know. I feel like this current situation would bias my opinion because we are currently being rained on. But I think if you look at the, what do you say? The like climate statistics. I looked at these like a month ago. Um, I forget them though. It's like whichever one gets more rain, I would imagine, is the one that gets less power. But I don't know because we get a lot of rain all at once. Actually, yeah, I would say so. Connecticut is overcast quite a bit. I'm just starting to remember things. Just had to rev it up. Um, Connecticut would have many days where it doesn't rain at all. It's just sort of misty, and
Yeah.
with a flat gray sky. Like you won't even see like variation in the grays for like, like, oh, this is like a storm cloud. Just the whole sky is a flat gray sheet sometimes in Connecticut. And so I would imagine that you don't get as much power there. But a lot of people in Connecticut have solar panels regardless. Um, so, yeah. But I find it interesting. Obviously, solar panels are the primary example. I mean, I don't think anyone really has a windmill set up in their backyard. But
One thing that is
yeah.
cool though, I just remembered this with solar panels, because of course, if you look at like a city like New York where they have all those
Mhm.
skyscrapers, that's a ton of real estate that they could use for
Mhm.
solar panels if they actually set them up. But
Yeah.
the thing is like, well, what about the windows? I have heard that they're actually working on transparent solar panels. So
I've heard about
like
this too.
obviously these ones are blue. That's like the default one that they have. I don't remember actually. But it's like actually it's I think I saw it on a TED video. If you guys, any viewers out there, want to look it up. But yeah, it's kind of like they use like dots or something, and then they immerse it in the glass, and it does some power storage that way. And I thought that was a cool up and coming thing that
Yeah, that's
engineers are
really
working
cool.
on.
Yeah, definitely.
So you might have solar panel windows.
Yeah, that's just
We're
so
doing a lot of jazz hands today.
jazz hands. Yeah. Um, yeah, that's really cool. There's a lot of interesting stuff. Like I think down in the American Southwest, they will actually have full-on solar farms, where they just
Ooh.
have, a big, wide open space, because there's a lot of empty land in, like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and they will use that land to just lay out a ton of solar panels, but not like flat on the ground. They'll be on little stands, and sometimes they will like rotate throughout the day to track the sun, because that's another thing with home power, like home solar panels. They are less efficient because they cannot track the sun. So if you had a solar panel that is flat on the ground, although these are not flat on the ground, but if you just imagine it, if they're flat on the ground, then at sunrise you won't be getting as much power as at noon, because of where the sun is. But in these large solar farms out in like the middle of the desert, they actually sort of rotate to follow the sun to stay at peak efficiency. Um, but home solar panels, the best they can do is pick one side of the roof. If you're in the northern hemisphere, they will pick the southern facing side, and if you're in the southern hemisphere, they will pick the northern facing side, because that is where the sun will be, in the south half of the sky or the north half of the sky. But yeah, that's home power generation. I find it interesting. Um, yeah. Oh, another small thing, I'm just remembering this, is that, and this might be some advice of something to get, is that when I was in Connecticut, my house was on like a back street. So I would always, people are getting frustrated currently about the power outage like lasting a week. For us, it would sort of always last a week. But in other parts of town, it would only last a few days. So people are getting, it's sort of like what you're used to changes your perspective on things. But so what I got eventually, like a few years ago, was a hand crank generator, and it made me very happy. I liked it. I liked the idea that I could say power my cell phone just by doing this.
It would
I,
take a long time.
it did. It took me like an hour or two, I think, just going like this, and I brought it from 0 to 20%. Um,
Wow.
but in an emergency, that would be very useful. The thing also doubles as a radio. So I was able to just pull
Fake
the,
radio, yeah.
yeah, pull the antenna, and it started like broadcasting information. And this was really funny because I remember at one point my home was out of power, but the school was not. So like, and we had school that day. Like they canceled it obviously for the storm, but then once the storm was past, they had school, but my house had not been fixed yet. So I went to school and I brought my little thing, my hand crank radio thing. So the thing also has like an internal battery that you charge as you do it. But yeah, it's so cool. I just really like it as a thing because it like has multi-purpose. But it was funny during lunch. I like pulled up the antenna and started listening to the radio quietly, and then one of the teachers was like no devices or whatever at like lunch, which was like a policy. But I imagine they were thinking like I had a phone, and I feel like they almost said like, "What is that?" Like I felt like they were starting to go like, "What?" and then just like sort of were like, "I don't care," like sort of this is not. I don't want to deal with this or whatever. But I feel like because the way I was holding it, they were expecting me to be on a phone, but then they're like, "Wait, what is that?" And I
Honestly,
kind of
the
wanted to
number
say,
of times like I've seen like because always like teachers will be like, oh, your calculator, oh wait, that's a
mm,
calculator, not a phone.
yeah,
And I'm like, oh, come on, teachers, how hard is it? I've now started doing it myself. Like I,
oh
as a
no,
math tutor, I will
uh-huh.
see kids like the high school kids, they'll have their calculators, and it's like like the big TIs, and like I'm always just like, why are you? And then I'm like, oh, and
Yep,
it's just so
sorry.
funny.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. I guess we sort of use these devices in the same way that we would a phone, like we
yeah,
sort of
it's the
hold
same
them
like
the same
thumb
way.
action, just kind
Yeah,
of happening.
yeah. But yeah, anyways, that's the power grid. So now we're gonna go into like causes of outages. So yeah, outages can be caused for many reasons. We have four listed below, and often it's like a combination of these things as well. It's not just, one thing. It's sort of a network of things, just as the grid is a network. So let's just get right into it. Let's start. We got trees, as promised. Um, so trees affect power lines in a very obvious way, as you can see from this picture. They fall on the above ground power lines. Um, I don't know where this picture was taken, but it kind of looks like something you might see in Connecticut, but maybe it's a bit further south. It looks more like a Virginia or something. Um, I don't know. I've had to, like, not personally drive, but I've had to be a passenger for the drive because we were moving stuff. Um, and I sort of like to see all the topology and the biomes and the climatology as you go up or down the country. I found it really interesting. So yeah, this looks more like halfway up, I would say. But the point is that trees fall on power lines like this, and this is very dangerous. What they'll have to do is turn off that power line because this tree is obviously grounded. So I don't know what to make of that. And like when lines are
Definitely,
down,
yeah.
yeah.
With
So
the same thing we were saying earlier with people, like it'll hit the tree, it'll go through it, and it
mm,
could probably like start burning.
mm, yeah, that's true. So it can start fires, but yeah, usually the power lines are like safe, like 10 feet above your head. But due to trees falling on them, they can actually like lag down, and the trees can also make the wires snap just because of the weight. And then what'll end up happening is that there's a live wire on the ground, and that is not good for anybody. Uh, and yeah, especially considering the trees can also be blocking the road. So someone might go to
Hmm.
like move a tree off the road, but then the tree's actually connected to a power line. Very dangerous situations. That's sort of what's going on in Connecticut right now, I would say. A lot of trees on power lines. I remember often when there would be a power outage, like sometimes it would just be completely inexplicable and you'd be like, why on earth is the power out? But then other times I would be like, oh, okay, I can walk 100 feet down my road and I can see there is a massive tree on this intersection blocking the road and we are not trapped because there's a second way out, but sometimes both ways out would get trees on them and then that would be quite the predicament. But
I
uh,
mean, I know I've also heard of squirrels doing this too,
mm,
where they'll just be running along, and if they hit it just right, then next thing you know, the wire's out because it fried a squirrel.
yep, yep,
Um, Unfortunate for the squirrel, of course. Um,
yeah,
I know that, yeah, like with hurricanes, especially like with Connecticut, you were saying, or other places that they have hurricanes, that's always a big issue because,
mhm,
like you were saying, it's not just the trees knocking out the power, the trees themselves are in the way. I know with Puerto Rico, that was a problem a few years ago when they had a hurricane because there were just trees everywhere, so a lot of stuff became inaccessible. You can also have mudslides that would knock stuff down and simultaneously make them inaccessible.
mhm,
Um, I know with Harvey also, Hurricane Harvey in, I want to say 2016, that was in the Houston area, because that place has a lot of concrete. There's no place for the water to run off to. It wouldn't get absorbed into the dirt because there was no dirt to absorb it. So you would end up getting floods everywhere. And then, of course, that's even more of a hazard than a tree because you can't just pick it up and get it out of the way.
yeah, exactly.
And of course, everybody knows water usually has like stuff dissolved into it that makes it pretty good conductor. So even if you tried to like save stuff, it's gonna make stuff electrocuted now. So
Hmm.
it's definitely bad with
Yeah,
storms in particular.
yeah. And so what'll happen is just like your house has circuit breakers, so you can like turn off a particular like room or, as you said, strange area uh,
Yeah.
of space. You can turn off that power. The power grid itself has that larger feature. So when someone reports that there is a tree on a line and a line's down, or sometimes I bet they can sense it because I don't know. if they have sensors, it
Yeah,
depends.
sudden anomaly, probably.
Yeah, they're making the grid smarter. That's a good thing. They're employing sensors.
Yeah,
But
actually,
yeah,
go ahead.
but yeah. So basically, when the tree knocks down a line, they as quick as they can, turn off the power to that line so the power stops coming. And so it won't be as dangerous. But yeah, I feel like you sort of have to adopt the policy like every downed wire could be a live wire. So like you're always supposed to avoid that. But what they do is they will turn off a line. Like once they make sure it's off, then they send out a crew to fix it. Because just like if you were to do electrical work on your house, you have to flip a circuit breaker. If you're going to fix a power line, you need to turn it off first. So they do that.
That's another thing with, I remember, same thing with trees again. You had in California a few years ago, they had a particularly bad wildfire where they like preemptively shut down power to certain areas. A lot of people were frustrated, but of course they're trying to do that so that if a power line does catch fire or there's the wildfire, if it does start on the trees or something, when stuff goes down, it won't. Oh, that was it. Sorry, it wasn't a wildfire. It was just an excessively hot year, and so they didn't want the power. It could be a supply surge because everybody wants to do their AC, or just it's too hot and the wire gets, I guess, a little irritated. They didn't want the wildfires to accidentally like start on one of the electric fires to start a wildfire. Sorry, that sentence was a little weird, but
No, I got
like
you. Yeah.
they don't want to start the wildfire, so they had to like preemptively turn off electricity to a certain area so that it would be less of a flammability risk.
Hmm. Yeah, I think
So
something like 1 million people, like 1 million customers, went without power for a while.
yeah,
Yeah,
definitely
I sort of remember
sensors could be an important thing and that kind of thing to like let us know if you need to actually turn it off or it'll be fine.
that. Yeah, it's interesting. Um, And then it's interesting. Another sort of frustrating thing, but like kind of makes sense, is that the power goes out, but you still have to pay for the electricity. Have to pay for the service. Even if you don't use it, just you sort of have the service, um, which is just sort of interesting. It always is a little frustrating. Actually, I think I remember once, like the electric company gave you hotel credits if your power was out. I think it
Oh,
depends on,
really?
but yeah, if you guys, anyone is currently, well, not currently, but the next time you're in a blackout, I would make sure to check with your power company because they might have some policies where they're like, okay, we'll give you, $100 hotel credit or something like for the night, um, if your power's out. So that's interesting.
I
Um,
know that insurance companies were like, especially with COVID, like fewer people are going out. They were
mm,
willing to temporarily reduce the price of like auto insurance, um, like and sort of to make up for the fact that you're not using your car anyway.
mhm,
Um, I know like a lot of universities they have complaints as well about like why don't you lower my tuition? I'm not even in the
mm,
building. Although
yes.
that comes into a whole nother can of worms
Yeah.
in terms of like paying for the maintenance of the buildings because even if you're not in them now,
Yeah.
you're going to be there next year, that kind of thing.
And they're still
Um,
paying the teachers.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's definitely interesting how like the preemptive stuff tries to help and whatnot.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, actually, with the auto insurance, it's also similar with like health insurance because less people are going in because they don't want to go in for like the sniffles or like they don't want to go in for something small when they're like going in could make me catch COVID, because
uh-huh.
there might be sick. So like people are a little wary of going to the hospital for like superfluous reasons. Although it has caused like people not to go for important reasons, but that's just a different thing. But the healthcare companies, and I imagine auto care might be, or the insurance companies, I imagine it might be similar for auto, but I know for health insurance, they're actually like not allowed to exceed like a certain profit margin. Like the government has these sort of regulations, that they have to stay under like 20% or something like that. So they actually gave people a credit preemptively because they didn't want to end up going over their profit margins because that would cause a whole thing where they would have to like I forget what the penalty would be.
That's interesting, actually.
Yeah, so they wanted to keep their profit margins like under the designated amount. Yeah, which is interesting. It's an interesting law, especially considering health insurance is still expensive, and so it's like I imagine it's on the side of like the healthcare products themselves are expensive rather than the insurance, because the insurance is only allowed to profit so much by the government, which is interesting. But what were we talking about? Trees. I don't know how we talked about health
We were
insurance.
talking about preemptive stuff, and
Yes,
that's what,
yeah.
yeah.
But yeah, anyway, that's trees. So we're gonna go to the next slide. The next slide is
Speaking of
hurricanes paired with
preemptive,
storms.
hurricanes.
Yeah,
We
or
do a lot of
just
preemptive stuff
storms.
for hurricanes.
But it's a picture of a hurricane,
Actually,
but it just says
that
this.
is honestly with personal experience, like you would think only hurricanes are going to be bad because of course they're known for their winds and stuff,
Mhm.
but even unnamed storms can do a lot of damage. Personally, actually, the Great Flood of 2016 in my Louisiana, where I'm from, that's actually, it was just caught between two waves of pressure and it stayed there for days and it didn't even have a name and it flooded a lot of stuff. So that's a cool way that like storms you may only. Another thing about hurricanes as well is that historically, the female named storms people prepare worse because of like
Oh,
innate sexism.
hmm.
Because they're like, oh, it's a girl storm, it's not gonna matter, and I find that really interesting too.
Yeah, that's
Um, I honestly, a meteorological episode would be interesting to me because I have a
yeah,
lot of
it
like
would be.
storm knowledge that would be
Yeah.
cool.
Actually, another thing along that vein is that the hurricane naming system, it used to be just that the meteorologists would just name the hurricanes after their wives, but then people,
Really?
yes, but then people were not happy about that. They objected to that. So then they tried to
I
make
know that
it
the hurricane
both.
names are a 6-year cycle.
Yeah, yeah, they're on a cycle, and then every once in a while, so like for Katrina, for instance, they'll be like, okay, this storm was really bad. We're gonna take it out of the running so that there's not like a lesser storm Katrina that like people could be referring to, so that there's only the one. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so, but yeah, so this is what I was saying, how it's sort of connected, because obviously the storms are what caused the trees to fall in Connecticut in this particular case. But just wind alone, I mean, I can't I don't know. It's a little iffy on the physics here because power lines are thin things. It's not like they have large sails attached to them that the wind can blow into. But at the same time, with like a square cube law type thing, they might be so small that they're like light. So, the wind tends to knock down trees to affect them, but sometimes the wind can just affect them on their own. Also, storms can result in lightning. Hurricanes tend to have, thunder, lightning, as there's thunder and lightning out right now. But if thunder and lightning, or not thunder and like not lightning, but the lightning, if the lightning strikes a piece of the electric grid, that would understandably cause a power outage. Um, and yeah, a big problem about storms is that they cause a lot of power outages together. So if you just have, it's an average sunny day and like, uh-oh, a tree fell. It was a sick tree, and I don't mean like sick. It was an infirm tree. It was dying, but people didn't really like remove it. They didn't realize. And so then the tree falls over on this random sunny day. You can get a crew out there very quickly and restore power. But in a storm, a ton of trees, some not even sick, some just on the weaker side, will end up falling over and knocking out, hundreds of power lines from one storm. And hurricanes are even more severe because whereas a single T cell, a little thunderstorm might, go over a smaller area, hurricanes span many like states often. So
And
you
they
will
usually
have,
have enough heat to sustain themselves too. Like, so it doesn't matter what speed their winds are per se, they can usually last longer over
yep,
land too.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so, but yeah, well, yeah, the higher wind speeds too do help to knock down more trees. It's interesting because in Connecticut, you look at the trees around you and you're like, these are centuries old trees. Why did they fall down today of all days? It's just that there are so many of them. Uh, there are hundreds of centuries old trees, and out of 100 centuries old trees, one per year falling would be reasonable. You would sustain the same number of trees. Um, so,
What is interesting as well is you mentioned wind, of course, but
mhm,
there's also the chance that whether it's healthy or sick, a tree could just spontaneously just be in the wrong place at the wrong time and get hit by lightning,
yes.
and just crack down the middle. I've seen that too. Like we
Ooh,
had this
yeah.
giant I want to say live oak, but it was just like a giant kind of sprawling tree in my neighborhood. And in one, I think it was actually Irma. So we were actually, that was a hurricane that hit Florida a couple years
Yep.
ago. So we were actually out of the state for that. But it ended up knocking it down and there were branches everywhere. Um, or even just a regular thunderstorm like the one that, us Floridians are having right now.
Yep.
You can just hear like a really loud crack all of a sudden as like you can tell a tree's been hit.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, Irma was like a tropical storm by the time it got up to Connecticut. They delayed school a week. Like, it was around the opening of school for Connecticut,
I
which
didn't
was
realize
later
it
than
lasted
ours.
all that long, all the way up there.
Yeah,
It got that
it's like
far. That's cool.
it's sort
I
of
mean,
it would hit the southern parts of the country first and then go up. Um, but yeah, so the main problem with the storm is that it causes many outages at once. And that begins to overwhelm the system, which you'll see in a little bit. But before we cover that, we've been focusing on the East Coast, and now let's go over the West Coast of the United States with earthquakes. So earthquakes are kind of like the West Coast version of hurricanes in terms of power outages, although they are less predictable. I think that we have, with all our seismologists on the case, we have gotten to the point that we can predict a earthquake 1 minute in advance. So you have
oh
60
wow,
seconds. You just see
yeah,
60 seconds appear in the corner of your vision. Uh-oh. Like, then you got to prepare.
yeah.
Whereas hurricanes, you at least get like, hey, there's,
Usually a week.
yeah, exactly. There's something in the water,
I mean,
above
obviously
the
that's
water.
it's a lot easier to see a hurricane because you can see the clouds. You
Hmm.
have like that image you had that was clearly like satellite imagery or something.
Yep.
Whereas earthquakes is underground; it's kind of hard to tell.
Yeah.
Um, that said, I think again more YouTube science knowledge I've found this time from SciShow. I saw a video also there that they learned that earthquakes they follow what's known as the Devil's Staircase.
Hmm.
And if you think about faults, this makes sense. So instead of just being like one random earthquake, just every 100 years or so, what it is it's more of a kind of like shuttering.
Hmm.
So it'll be like one earthquake, then another, then nothing for a good long time, then some more, then nothing, because the way the plates hit each other, it's more of a kind of they don't just hit each other and be like, okay, I'm done. They usually hit each other and then grind into each other a little bit, and
Yeah.
then something else.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, that's interesting.
that's a little bit
Um,
more that's been helpful and predictive
yeah.
stuff with earthquakes.
Hmm. That's great. Yeah. But yeah, so they're very unpredictable, but they also cause lines to go down. That is why, California puts their lines underground, but I don't know, even say like the shifting of rock could even say sever a power line. Um, if it's rarer, that's like it's obviously it's more likely to fall over. Um, but they if they have like tunnels underground that they go through, an earthquake might be able to sort of collapse that tunnel, and that would be a problem. Um, but yeah, earthquakes, it's sort of similar to what I was talking about just for what we were talking about for hurricanes and storms. Uh, they just sometimes cause power outages, just either by knocking over a telephone pole, or they can knock over a tree that knocks over a telephone pole, just a variety of things.
I just actually, when you first mentioned the fact that they are like underground, I was like, wow, that's kind
Yeah.
of weird because you would think that it's in the ground and the ground is what's shaking. That's probably a
Yes.
bad
Yeah.
idea. Although now that I think about like if you just consider like how exposed the above grounds are,
Mhm.
that's probably why they do it because the underground
Yeah.
ones they have a lot of insulation. Same thing with like deep sea connections of the internet. Like they
Mm.
have to put a ton of insulation to
Yeah.
make sure the stuff around it doesn't screw it up by accident. So they're probably more secure that way. They're definitely
Yeah,
more secure in like hurricanes. I've never been on the east or west coast, so I don't really know what to say. I wonder if we have any east coast or sorry, west coast.
yeah,
If we have any west coast viewers, any
yeah.
comments, that'll be
We
interesting
might.
to hear.
We might. I have relatives that live in California. I have never been there for an earthquake though, because
Hmm.
I guess it's just a lottery type system. But if you live there for a while, I guess you get used to sort of. Sometimes there are small quakes too. So if you feel like, is this shaking? And then you're like, oh no, I'm just, shaking my leg, like when you do, as you do when you're sitting at a desk. You don't see my legs, but you know what I'm talking about probably. Like if you're like taking a test or something and you're like, oh no, I'm running out of time. But something like that. Could be causing the shaking, and so you're like, oh, it's just that person. Um, but anyway, earthquakes, yeah, if you have like if you think about the oscillation of the ground for a little bit, like the ground like moving back and forth, if you have a tall power line, the oscillation sort of gets amplified because towers are not good with like centers of gravity. Essentially, that's basically the problem. Is that their center of gravity is somewhere around halfway up, and then their base is like a small cross section. And if the earthquake causes enough shaking that the base is not underneath the center of gravity, then it will fall over.
Same thing with trying to balance a pencil by
Yep.
its tip, for
Yep.
sure.
Yeah, exactly. Got a little pen here. Difficult.
Are you
Uh,
actually going to try balancing it?
no, it's not. But yeah, so that's sort of earthquakes. They also cause power outages. And then obviously, if like the more devastating earthquakes can make buildings collapse, and if a building collapses, naturally the power line in front of it would sort of go too. So just general destruction, earthquakes and hurricanes are not good for anybody. But yeah, let's get to the second to last slide before the final thoughts. Last slide before the final thoughts, and then the final thoughts at the last slide. So, power surges. This is a power strip that has, I guess, failed at its surge protecting duties, right? Because it
Yeah,
has
we've
burnt.
talked a bit about these already today.
Yeah, it has burnt to a crisp. Started a fire. Not good. Not good to start an
Probably
electric.
because you put a power cord into a power strip or an extension cord into a power strip. Maybe
Mm.
you tried that. Actually, do you know which of these is most common for a source of outages?
Well, it depends on the place, and
True.
it's also a lot of these things together because that's what I was about to say. The final thing about surges is that sometimes when one power line goes down, the way the system works, like the power grid system, is that say that you have this amount of power going down a line and then it splits into 10 lines. If, 9 of those lines are knocked out, then the last line is receiving 10 times as much power as it is used to. Um, and if that cannot be corrected, then it'll result in a power surge where even though there was nothing wrong with that last line, it'll end up uh, going out of service as well because it will overheat and sort of you might see the transformers might go with sound effects from movies like it's always the same sound. um,
Yep.
so so that's sort of what power surges can happen. And then obviously, I guess it could sort of also come from a glitch in the system where like power demand suddenly drops, but they weren't predicting it and they didn't respond fast enough. So then there's too much power in the system. That could cause power surge and then cause, a line to go down. But yeah, as you were asking with commonality, uh, it's sort of complicated because the hurricanes tend to cause the trees to fall, and the trees falling tends to cause surges to happen. So it's all a mess. But I can say for commonality that earthquakes don't really happen on the East Coast, and hurricanes don't really happen on the West Coast. So that would be the commonality for those two, for causing outages. But Yeah, that sort of surges. It's interesting because the interconnectedness of the system that usually helps out can backfire quite literally and very destructively in worsening an outage. So that is why I believe 98% of Connecticut was out. Not because 98% of the grid was destroyed, but because enough was destroyed that it caused a cascade failure. Because the thing is, if you have one surge, it worsens the problem. Say uh, a tree falls on a power line and now one line is out, but that one line being out causes a surge. Now two lines are out. Two lines are out may cause two more lines to surge, and then it exponentiates, and you end up with all the lines surging. Um, so that is, in my opinion, my diagnosis for Connecticut is sort of, the hurricane. Enough lines went down that it caused cascade failure power surges, and yeah. So the way to prevent this would sort of be having redundancies, but redundancies are expensive. Um, so you could say have twice as many power lines in the system and only use half of them most of the time. And then when a tree falls, it's diverted to the next power line and yay, no power surges. But that would be expensive. It would cause, rates to go up. Uh, and they have already gone up, say in Connecticut. People are not happy about that. People have been complaining about that. They've been like, our rates go up and then we get a power outage that lasts a week. How dare you? Uh,
I mean, of course, they're built with a certain degree of contingency or
yeah,
redundancies. 'Cause if they don't, then like there's codes for that. Like they
yeah,
have to. But
yeah,
yeah, definitely would be expensive, probably to add more.
yeah, exactly. They have enough redundancies to deal with day-to-day minutia. Say like they have to just routine service. They need to take a line off the grid for a moment so that they can routinely operate on it, and they don't want to cause a power outage with that. But with large storms and earthquakes, the system is not particularly prepared for things like that, and the contingencies are over. I don't know. They are overwhelmed. Yes, and the power can surge. So that's kind of everything. Um, but yeah, it is interesting. People are sort of mad at the electric company in Connecticut. I will not name the company, but they pretty much have a monopoly over the power lines. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. They don't own the power plants. The power plants sell power to them, and then they buy the power, and then they sell it to the consumer who buys it from them. So they're sort of like a middleman. But they're not 100% useless because they also fix the lines when they break. Because they can't sell their purchased goods. They can't resell the power unless they have power lines up and running. Um, but people have sort of been complaining that, it's a company that's, a monopoly for like, it's like the whole state of Connecticut uses this one company.
A lot of states have just one or two companies that run them
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. And so the
It's
problem
a
with
little
that,
hard to kind of up and start your own electric company to
yeah,
compete, I would think.
you can't like start your own electric company. Definitely. That
The
would be
mom and pop
a
electric store.
difficult prospect. There's no way to really do that effectively. You would have to build a second power grid, which would be stupid. No one would take it. They'd be like, we already have a power grid. We're not going to fund your new power grid. But so it kind of makes sense why it might end up in the hands of like a monopoly, but people are unsatisfied about that. Like people have been like, the CEO makes like 30 million and we're all out of power. Like, uh, people have been frustrated, understandably. Um, yeah, so I don't know. I feel like a better system might be if like they contract multiple companies, like if the sort of state of Connecticut government were to say like, okay, these are our power lines, because I'm pretty sure they are publicly owned. The power lines, I'm not sure about that. But
It'd be an interesting thing to look into as well.
um, maybe the company owns the power lines themselves, but I think it would be interesting for the state to pretty much purchase the power lines from the company, or if they already own them, to like sort of contract and say, hey, X town, if you are unhappy with the current contract, you can, end the contract and contract a new company if you think they will do better. That would sort of keep the companies in line, because when there's a monopoly, obviously, there's not as
That's
much.
the whole thing about capitalism, though. It's a
Yeah,
very complicated system.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. It's complicated, but basically, there's like, as a monopoly, there's not as much incentive to do well, because you're sort of safer if you mess up a little bit, whereas messing up in another company might end your business, um, but people are frustrated and blah blah blah. So this isn't about politics, this is about the power grid, but I thought it might be nice to mention.
Power comes back soon.
Yeah, yeah. So let's get to the final slide. We got final thoughts. uh, i thought I thought this was a very good episode. I am glad that you joined me today, Jennifer. Um,
Yes, thank you for having me.
yeah, of course. This was a fun episode. This was the first episode where Sebastian has not been able to make it. And I assume maybe at some point in the future, I may not be able to make it. So then he'll pretty much do the same thing. Uh, so yeah, I don't know. He's probably not watching right now because I don't think he has
Do we
power.
have any comments right now, or any comments at all?
Uh, we we had like 3 concurrent viewers at one point.
Mm.
So yeah. So let's see. What was I saying? Yeah, Sebastian. I hope you get power back. Maybe you might rewatch this. Maybe not. I don't know if It's a long thing. Eventually, I do want to bring this to the podcast app, or some podcast apps, because this is sort of a podcast format, and I feel like people might like to listen to podcasts while exercising or something, and YouTube isn't like the best for doing that. So although we have visuals, and I think the visuals are important for the show, maybe there's something we can figure out with that. So I'll be figuring that out in the coming weeks and months to eventually get that, probably for season 5. So let's see. Um, but if anyone was watching, and if anyone is rewatching, I would like to thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you learned something. And yeah, again, thank you, Jennifer, for filling in last minute. I think it was what was it, Wednesday night?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, Wednesday night, when we were freaking out about dual enrollment applications with our school. Uh, we sort of, segued, I forget how, to this topic. And, it's been really fun to have you on the show. And I hope you come back. You can come back whenever you'd like. Um, and next time, Sebastian will be here, hopefully. So, yeah.
Can be definitely complicated. I know when I was a kid, apparently I'm too young to remember this at this point. The first time I had to power out from a hurricane, I thought it was just kind of like a fun adventure, kind of camping in my own house. And the next year when hurricane season rolled around, I was like, are we going to get to go camping again? Which of course, if you're older, you realize not the most fun way, not the most planned camping for sure.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
yeah, I definitely. You guys don't have AC problems up there in Connecticut, but I'm hoping it's the weather is treating you all right, that you guys get your power back sometime soon. And then Sebastian can come back for the
Yeah,
show.
exactly. Yep. Yeah, I imagine, I don't know, it's right around the time of year where it shifts from being too hot to too cold. So it might be, that's the weather in Connecticut tends to be too hot, too cold, and then for 1 week, pretty nice. But yeah, so yeah, that's it for this episode. I am glad it went really well. We've almost gone for 2 hours now. So thank you for, giving 2 hours of your time. And yeah, thank you all for watching. I'm just gonna end the stream here. Fun episode. All right. End stream.